If you're drawn to stories that crawl under your skin and refuse to let go, make sure you're subscribed, drop a like, and leave a comment now, because once this story starts, there's no turning back. The lights on Interstate 25 blurred into white streaks as the convoy tore through southern Colorado before dawn. 3 black vehicles, no markings, moving fast and silent. Inside the middle van sat a man who, just 12 hours earlier, had been sentenced to multiple life terms in federal court. No press conference followed. No statement. The judge had barely finished speaking before the defendant was pulled through a side door, wrists cuffed, eyes forward. The paperwork called it post-sentencing transport. The system had another name for it. ADX Florence. By sunrise, the world would pretend he no longer existed. The convoy didn't slow as the terrain flattened and the outline of the Rocky Mountains faded behind them. When the prison finally appeared, it didn't rise dramatically or announce itself with towers. It crouched low against the land, concrete and steel blending into the color of dust. From a distance, it looked unfinished, almost temporary. Up close, it felt permanent in a way nothing else did. This was where the federal system sent people after sentencing when it decided the story wasn't over, when it decided the risk hadn't ended in the courtroom. Inside the administrative building, the air was colder than outside. Not from temperature, but from design. The man being processed was stripped of his name and replaced with a number. Personal effects were logged, sealed, and archived. The intake officer didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every movement here was procedural, every word measured. What happens after sentencing at ADX Florence is not written in court transcripts or sentencing memos. It happens in layers, behind doors that never open at the same time, inside a system designed to remove not just freedom, but presence. The inmate was led down a corridor where sound seemed to disappear. The walls absorbed it. No echoes, no distant chatter, just footsteps and breathing. He passed doors without windows, each one hiding someone the public once knew by name. Terrorists, cartel leaders, domestic extremists, men whose crimes reshaped laws, headlines, and lives. The cell he was assigned to measured slightly larger than a parking space. A concrete bed, a concrete desk, a narrow slit of glass angled toward the sky. The door closed with a mechanical certainty that didn't feel like confinement. It felt like conclusion. And yet, this was only the beginning. Thousands of miles away, in a federal building in Washington, D.C., Special Agent Laura Keene stared at a case file she thought had ended with that sentencing. She had led the investigation for 3 years, watched it fracture friendships, destroy careers, and cost lives in quieter ways. When the jury returned its verdict, she wanted to believe, that it was done. Then the alert came through her secure line. ADX intake confirmed. That wasn't unusual. What followed was a restricted notation, visible only to a handful of agencies. A flag that hadn't been there before. Not about the inmate's past, but about his future. A classification review scheduled unusually fast. Internal. Closed. Keene leaned back in her chair, the room suddenly feeling smaller. ADX Florence didn't rush. It didn't need to. When it moved quickly, it was because something underneath had shifted. She remembered the first body. It had been found 18 months earlier in a warehouse outside St. Louis, positioned carefully, no sign of forced entry. The victim wasn't random. He was a former logistics contractor tied to federal transport systems. At the time, the connection seemed abstract, theoretical. It took months before the pattern sharpened. Witnesses disappeared. Financial records vanished. One informant recanted, then vanished himself. Every step forward came with resistance that felt coordinated, disciplined. The man now sitting alone in a concrete box was supposed to be the center of it all. Supposed to be. Back at ADX Florence, the inmate's first day unfolded without incident. Meals delivered through a slot. 1 hour of solitary recreation in a concrete pen open to the sky. No human contact beyond gloved hands and neutral commands. This was the system at its most controlled. But systems rely on people. 3 days after intake, a senior corrections official filed an anomaly report. Minor, on paper. A discrepancy in routine communications monitoring. Not content, timing. Messages that shouldn't have aligned did. Requests that hadn't been made were acknowledged. The report was buried in a queue of thousands. Until someone elevated it. Keene arrived in Colorado under the pretense of a routine interagency review. She wasn't given a tour. She wasn't allowed beyond administrative corridors. Still, she felt it. The tension beneath the silence. Staff speaking carefully, eyes flicking to cameras even when discussing logistics. She met with the warden in a room without windows. "You don't need to worry," he said calmly. "The inmate is contained." "That's not what I asked," Keene replied. She slid a photograph across the table. Grainy. Taken from a traffic camera weeks before the sentencing. It showed a vehicle long believed destroyed. Still operational. Still moving. The warden studied it longer than necessary. ADX isn't about punishment, he said finally. It's about control after sentencing. Keene stood. Then explain why control is already slipping. That night, as snow began to fall over the high desert, an internal alarm sounded briefly inside the prison. It was resolved in under 30 seconds. Logged as a sensor fault. No lockdown initiated. No report sent beyond the facility. But in the security office, one junior analyst replayed the footage again and again. For just a moment, less than a second, the camera feed outside one cell went dark. When it returned, the inmate was standing, smiling, and carved into the concrete desk, something that hadn't been there before, waited to be found. The carving was discovered at 5:42 a.m. during the first silent round of the day. A corrections officer paused at the cell longer than protocol required. He wasn't looking at the inmate, but at the words etched into the concrete desk. They were shallow, deliberate, and impossibly clean for a place where nothing sharp was allowed. Process is power. The phrase meant nothing to the officer, but it meant everything to Laura Keene. By the time she was notified, the desk had been photographed, scrubbed, and sealed. The inmate sat on his bed, hands folded, his posture perfectly calm. He didn't deny carving it. He didn't explain it either. He only asked one question, his voice steady through the slot in the door. "Did they tell you what happens next?" Keene stood behind the one-way glass, watching the man who had consumed years of her life through transcripts and surveillance stills. In person, he looked smaller, less like a mastermind, more like an accountant who'd wandered into the wrong building. "What happens next," she said, her voice amplified into the cell, "is you disappear." He smiled again. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It was a certain one. "That already happened," he replied. ADX Florence, the country's most secure Supermax prison, responded the only way it knew how, by tightening control. Movement schedules were altered. Monitoring increased. Internal communications were put under a microscope. The classification review Keene had seen flagged was quietly accelerated, then just as quietly canceled. No explanation followed. That was when the second anomaly occurred. A secure transport request appeared in the system under an authorization code that hadn't existed for years. The destination wasn't another prison. It was a federal medical facility listed as inactive. The request was marked pre-approved, and it was time-stamped 6 hours before the inmate had even arrived at ADX Florence. Keene didn't sleep that night. She laid the case files out across her hotel desk, drawing lines where no one else would. The logistics contractor from St. Louis with a sealed record. The informant who had simply vanished. The dormant facility. It wasn't a network built on ideology or chaos. It was built on procedure, on exploiting the trust that systems place in their own paperwork. The inmate hadn't been moving messages from inside ADX. He didn't need to. The message was the sentencing itself. Everything that came after was just an automated response. She requested an emergency meeting. It was denied. She escalated. Silence. The system wasn't pushing back against her. It was closing ranks, protecting itself. At dawn, the prison initiated what they called a routine internal transfer drill. No press, no alerts. On paper, it was a simple compliance test. In reality, it was the execution of that ghost authorization. Keene raced to the facility, arriving at the gates just as the transport convoy formed. Different vehicles this time, different drivers, but the same unsettling silence. She flashed credentials that should have stopped everything in its tracks. They didn't. The warden met her outside, snow crunching beneath his polished shoes. "This isn't your jurisdiction anymore, Keene." "It never was yours," she shot back. "You're moving him." The warden didn't deny it. "We're following procedure." "That procedure," she said, her voice dropping, "was written by him." The convoy rolled. Keene watched the gates close, a feeling settling in her chest that had nothing to do with failure and everything to do with recognition. The case hadn't been about stopping a man. It had been about exposing a method. And methods don't sit in cells. 2 weeks later, a sealed oversight report crossed her desk. It detailed a successful medical transfer. No complications, no irregularities. The inmate was now housed in a restricted wing, location classified. The phrase ongoing risk neutralized appeared twice. Officially, the system had won. Keene closed the file. 3 months passed. The public moved on. Headlines shifted. ADX Florence returned to its reputation as the end of the line. The inmate's name faded into databases and footnotes. Then a body was found, not in a warehouse this time, but in a government archive facility scheduled for demolition. The victim was a mid-level analyst from a federal agency no one outside of Washington ever talked about. There was no sign of struggle, just a single folder placed beside him. Inside were copies of transport authorizations, old ones, inactive ones, ones that had still been honored. Stamped across the top of the final page, in stark red ink, were the same words that had been carved into concrete hundreds of miles away. Process is power. Keene read the report alone in her office, the low hum of the building suddenly deafening. The inmate was still officially incarcerated, still unreachable, still contained. And yet, the pattern continued. She realized then what the man's sentencing had really been. Not an end. It was a shield. By placing himself inside ADX Florence, the most controlled prison in the country, he had become untouchable. Any action linked to him now passed through so many layers of authority and procedure that responsibility simply dissolved. The system was protecting him by insisting it had already won. Keene drafted a memo she knew would never be read, outlining the truth in language so careful it felt dishonest. She saved it. Then she locked it away. Some stories don't end with arrests or trials. Some end with systems proving they can't see past their own design. Years later, long after Keene retired, a new inmate arrived at ADX Florence. During intake, as he was being processed, he noticed faint marks on a concrete desk, scratches almost worn away by time and cleaning. He didn't know what they meant. But somewhere, deep in the architecture of federal procedure, something stirred. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.